Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for the SPP Summer Outlook. We're going to give people 2 or 3 more minutes here to sign in, and then we'll kick things off. In the meantime, if you have any questions or have any technical difficulties, feel free to, you should have a question box in the bottom of your screen there, so let us know. All right, everyone, we're going to kick things off here with the SPP Summer Outlook. My name is Steve Maestranzi, and I'm the head of our SPP and MISO desk here at Genscape. And in the room with me, we also have Josh Seneschal, our meteorologist, Jared Verga, one of our SPP analysts, and Adam Jordan, our other SPP analyst. So you'll be hearing from all of us throughout the presentation today. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, if you have any questions, I'd love to keep the dialogue going throughout. So feel free to type in your questions down in the bottom section of your screen there, and we'll try to answer the questions as we go along. So feel free to type them in at any point throughout the presentation. And then at the end, there will be a short survey to provide feedback, so feel free to fill that out as well. So with that said, let's kick things off. What we're going to cover here, similar to our past presentations, is a quick recap of the spring and what we saw as far as pricing and congestion. Then we'll move into the weather and demand outlook for the summer, some notes on what we're seeing for supply, and our congestion outlook for the summer. So jumping right in, we'll take a quick look at what we saw this spring as far as pricing. And I guess the major thing to point out here is kind of an interesting trend that we noticed for the first time in May, and it's the first time since last January that we saw positive DART spreads for a month. We'll see in the congestion slide in a second as well that this seems to be a reversal of what we've seen for a number of months in a row here, that SPP is actually modeling in a bit more day-ahead congestion than what we end up seeing in the real time. For the month of May, and this was through May 24th, the average MCCs for South Hub were $2.85 in the day-ahead, but only $1.05 in the real time. And this is kind of one of the first times we've seen that trend, as we said, since January earlier in the year. And the main driver of this, as you can see on this slide, ends up being the change in congestion patterns. I say this as a kind of a broken record. For the, I don't know how many consecutive months here, we've seen Osage to Canyon East and Woodward congestion being the top constraints in both the day-ahead and real-time markets. However, for the first time since we've been doing these outlooks, you actually see a higher shadow price for the day-ahead than we do for the real-time. And that actually holds true for the top 3 constraints that we saw based on the average shadow price for the spring period. So again, that is a definite flip from what we've been seeing really since the start of the integrated marketplace. To us, this indicates that SPP is definitely starting to either get a better handle on the market or even over-model the congestion. But we're noticing this more and more, particularly now with the Woodward, as we move into May and, even to start June here, that Woodward congestion is binding much heavier in the day ahead with less of an impact in the real-time market. The other constraint on here, the third highest, is this Fairport to Osborne. For those of you in the TCR markets, this was the one that SPP contributed mainly to what caused the underfunding in the March TCR period. This constraint was specifically driven by an outage at Ireton to Easttown and the outage of the Wolf Creek Nuke. And according to SPP's data, the real issue here was that Ireton to Easttown was not submitted within the 45-day window for the March auction period. It was actually put on about 40 days before the outage. So did not get modeled in for March and ended up being, one of the strongest constraints we saw in the March period. But again, what we're seeing here, and I think the thing to really highlight as far as pricing and congestion go is just that we are definitely starting to see a trend where day-ahead congestion is stronger than the real-time for the vast majority of the constraints that we're seeing and for the strongest ones. So now we're going to jump into the weather recap, and Josh is going to kick it off here with a look at what happened this spring as far as the weather goes.
Yeah, sure. All right, so taking a look at spring weather, I guess we'll start looking at the month of March. And overall, the SPP footprint was kind of in a transition zone in March. We saw really warm conditions just west of the footprint. We did see, Wichita running a few degrees above normal, a few areas off to the north and west. But in terms of our major demand centers for March, it was generally a pretty seasonable month. Oklahoma City, Kansas City, generally within a couple degrees of normal. And that was generally what we saw for the month of March. Now, once we headed into the month of April, we saw above normal temperatures, generally 2 to 4 degrees above normal across the majority of the footprint. And this kind of coincided with a reconfiguration of the jet stream. We saw a really amplified jet stream in March. April, it kind of flattened out a little bit. We saw some warmer conditions, finally got some cooling load. And also, along with that cooling load, we did have a notable increase in severe weather outbreaks, actually the first of which started up late in March, and then we had a pretty active April. And then May, although we don't have the picture on this slide, we did have a very cool May. We also had an incredibly wet May. The majority of the footprint was about 3 to 6 degrees below normal, and we did see pretty weak demand really over the last couple of weeks. There were a few days in the last few weeks that were 20 degrees below normal. So we did see a pretty chilly May, extremely wet, and that kind of depressed demand a little bit. So I figured we'd take a quick look at one of our more notable severe weather outbreaks. This is one of the first of the season, and it was definitely one of the more intense ones. March 25th, we did see an outbreak of thunderstorms in the afternoon and evening right on what we call a dry line. And it was interesting because both Oklahoma City and Tulsa metro areas were impacted by tornadoes. And if you look at the image on the top of the slide here, you see the area that's circled in red. That represents a 300 megawatt drop in demand from 1 hour to the next. And that was coincidental with 2 tornado impacts, again, one in Oklahoma City and one in the Tulsa metro areas, which I thought was interesting. And that's kind of one of the volatility aspects of severe weather. A lot of the time, it's really tough to predict these big swings in demand when you have severe weather. So taking a look at demand overall, if you look at the average peaks, we really didn't see a lot of variability for March, April, and May. On average, March did have the strongest demand by just a fraction of a gig compared with May. We typically saw a fair amount of heating load, at least early on in the month of March. April was that transition region. That's why we saw the weakest average demand, only 25.3 gigs. And then once we got into May, we did see an average of 26.8, and that coincided with warming temperatures and increased cooling load. And then looking at peak demand, looking at all 3 months, we had our peak actually for the spring in March, and that's really not a surprise considering how cool May was. That March peak, I believe, was early in the month. We did have a couple of pretty cold mornings there, lows dropping down in the 20s across much of the footprint, and that just shows us that heating load outperformed cooling load for the spring months. So before we get into our official summer forecast, we'll do a quick recap of what we saw last summer. And it was kind of similar to what we saw in MISO. It was a generally seasonal summer when you average June, July, and August. We did see some differences when you break down, when you look at the individual months. June was seasonal. July was very cool. Most of the footprint was 3 to 6 degrees below normal. And if you look at the bottom right and you look at the peak demand, we only saw a 4 gig increase from June into July. And that's not much of a surprise considering how cool July was. It kind of depressed that normally big increase in demand that you would expect from June into July. As we head into August, we saw a return closer to normal temperatures. We also had our summer demand peak, 45.2 gigs, less than a gig above July, but it is notable that in the last few years, it seems like our peak demand is typically either the last week of July or the first week of August. So taking a look at our official summer forecast, we are going with a warm summer, not quite hot for SPP. I think the warmest conditions are going to be off to the east, focused more towards St. Louis. But we are going with above normal temperatures, especially for Kansas City and Omaha, very close to the Tulsa area. We should see some pretty good cooling demand. Oklahoma City and Wichita points west. We think it's going to be slightly above normal, but we're only talking about a degree or two. And then westernmost portion of the footprint overall, we think it'll be closer to seasonal summer. In terms of rainfall, near normal for most of the footprint, slightly below normal right on the eastern edge. But overall, we are expecting a pretty warm summer. Our analog years that we used in our forecast were 1941, 1977, 80, 87, and 05. And I think by far our best analog year was 1987. And that also was a warm summer, not quite hot, but it was above normal for most of the footprint.
Got a question here.
What
is PDO?
Yes, the PDO it's what we call a teleconnection. It's a Pacific Decadal Oscillation. So it's this long-term pattern in ocean temperatures in the Pacific Ocean. It's very similar to El Nino. The only difference is it's focused farther east in the Pacific. So this is one of the what we call teleconnections that kind of predict large-scale patterns across the United States. Normally, if you have an El Nino, you have a positive PDO. That's what you typically expect. We have an El Nino right now, but we've actually seen PDO weakening, which is a little bit atypical, and that's why we're kind of going with an atypical summer outlook. We're actually going for above normal temperatures despite an El Nino. So. Anyways, looking at the monthly breakdown, so for the month of June, we think most of the footprint, at least a couple degrees above normal. Strongest warmth focused across Kansas City and Omaha, Oklahoma City, and Wichita, Tulsa, generally about 1 to 2 degrees above normal. Heading into July, we do think we're going to see above normal warmth persisting across many of the major demand centers of eastern SPP, although it does look like western areas are going to trend a little bit closer to normal. We have Oklahoma City kind of right on the border between normal and slightly above normal. But again, we do think we're going to see some pretty good heat, especially early in the month of July, and that should give us some pretty good cooling load, a little demand volatility as well. And then August, I think we're going to see temperatures return closer to normal. A lot of the best chances for heat are going to be focused early in the month. And I do think I have pretty good confidence we're going to see our peak demand either the last week of July or the first week of August associated with those temperature patterns.
All right. Thanks, Josh. We have another question here, same subject. Something we've got a couple of. We are showing warmer forecasts. Some other weather vendors are showing cooler. So the PDO you mentioned, how does that play in how do we land a different conclusion? Basically, why are we warm?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Yeah, because the majority of other vendors are considerably cooler. Well, one of the better predictors, we did mention the PDO. I do think the El Nino is going to be the number one climate predictor. And it's interesting because in a typical El Nino summer, it's usually cool for most of the Midwest, most of the plains. But when you look at El Nino summers where El Nino conditions were already in place several months beforehand, there's a considerably warmer look. So you can separate El Nino summers into two bins essentially. Summers where El Nino conditions have already been present versus years where El Nino conditions developed during the summer. We've had an El Nino in place since last fall, and that's why our outlook's considerably hotter, because we eliminated years where El Nino developed during the summer. It's already been in place. So that's kind of the differentiator, I guess.
All right, thanks.
Hopefully that clears things up.
Yeah, if we need to go into that more, just keep the questions
keep
coming.
grilling me. All right, yep, and so we'll take a look at some historical weather trends. Cooling load typically increases through June into July, usually peaking in the last few weeks of July into the first week of August, and that's coincidental with the warmest temperatures and strongest cooling load. Our forecast for above normal temperatures across Kansas City and Tulsa should drive above normal cooling degree days. We do think we're going to see more seasonal conditions, Oklahoma City, Wichita, and points west. So we're not expecting a hot summer for the entire footprint, about 2/3 of it, and we do think we're going to see above normal cooling demand, at least in the months of June and July. And then talking more about our monthly demand peaks, as I mentioned, we do think we'll see above average demand, not significantly above average, but at least a few gigs above the average for June and July. August, we did have closer to seasonal temperatures, and as a result, I think we're going to see near to below normal demand during the month of August. So I think our best chance of some really good demand and volatility is really going to be during the months of June and July. And forecast risks, I kind of touched upon this with that last question. Again, the main risk to our forecast is definitely cooler. As I mentioned, your normal El Nino summer consists of below normal temperatures. That image in the top left right there, that is a composite of all El Nino summers since 1950. And the colors there represent the anomalies. And obviously, as you can see, the majority of the footprint is at least a little bit below normal. That's your typical El Nino, but as I mentioned before, what's interesting about this summer is we've had El Nino conditions in place already for several months. Our PDO, with the image on the right, I have the area circled there. Those blue colors represent a weakening PDO, and when you combine a long-term El Nino with a weakening PDO, you typically get a warmer signal, and that's why we're going warm. But again, the risk to our forecast most definitely is in the cooler direction. And I guess we'll finish up the weather-related slides with wind. And it's interesting because June wind generation is typically rather strong. It peaks late in the evening during the overnight hours, but we do see a pretty substantial drop in wind generation from June into July. August is usually very close with July. We don't see a significant decrease in the wind, but June into July is typically where we see the greatest decline in wind generation. Again, peak wind late in the afternoon during the overnight hours.
All right, and now we're jumping into the supply section of the presentation here. Typically, this is where we would talk about unit outages and planned outages, but for the summer, as you would expect, we typically don't have a significant number of planned unit outages. And as you can see, the difference between kind of what we looked at for the supply stack last year on average and what we're looking at right now in May, you notice a significant increase in the amount of coal generation for the most part, and a decrease somewhat in the wind, as Josh just mentioned. And that's what we're expecting, as we move into the summer months. We're already starting to see a lot of this coal-fired generation come back into the stack. Last summer coal averaged about 18.7 gigs versus 12 gigs this May. So as that demand starts to kick back up, we'll start to see some of these more marginal coal units running more, and just in general, these units returning from outage. The other thing that we were looking at, we did still, when we first put together this presentation, we had the Fort Calhoun nuke as well as the Cooper nuke offline. Cooper did return this morning, and Fort Calhoun is still off, but we are not anticipating that outage to last very far into the month of June. So, we're actually expecting that unit to be back up sometime this week or early into next week. But definitely not heading into July and August. We expect all the nukes in SPP to be back up and running. So that's really it. So moving on to kind of what we're seeing for some of the new builds as far as supply goes. On the gas side of things, this was just an interesting unit to take a look at. There is a new GT being built down in the Lubbock, Texas area. This is a 200 megawatt GT that we actually believe is already testing, and it was scheduled to come online at some point this summer, likely by July. It's an interesting unit. It's got a new type of GE turbine, which should be able to ramp up to 70% of load within a 10-minute window. And we mentioned this, and as you can see on the graphic to the left side there, this unit is going to tap in at the Tuco substation and is on the bullish side of the Osage to Canyon East constraint. So looking at this, and depending on how they're able to dispatch this unit, if it is a quick start unit, it should in theory be able to come up and help alleviate the Osage congestion when that binds. So definitely something worth watching for as we move into the midsummer and when this unit really starts to get involved in the footprint. The other thing we're looking at is that this unit's also supposed to have so right now it's just 200 megawatts. They're supposed to build another 400 total megawatts to make it a combined 600 megawatt plant. And as they do that, they're also installing some new transmission that's going to allow this unit to dispatch into ERCOT. Once we see that happen in 2016, our expectation is that similar to the Kiamichi plant, this unit will rarely run in SPP, but that's still at least another summer away at this point. And then the next thing we're looking at here is some new builds for wind. SPP actually noted that there is as much as 1,800 megawatts of new wind generation that could be installed by the end of the summer. I know everyone's very excited about that because that's what we need in SPP is more wind. But a couple of these farms are worth noting. Two of the larger farms. This Balco Wind project is going to tap in at the Beaver County substation over in the Oklahoma Panhandle. This one we're keeping an eye on as, basically we just see that adding additional wind in an area that's already saturated with wind and flowing power right into the Woodward to FPL constraint area. So we're anticipating that, when there's high wind days, this is just another 300 megawatts that's going to help load up the contingencies around Woodward and likely serves to make this congestion worse as we move into the summer. And then the other one is this, I don't believe it has a formal name as of yet, but it is in Kay County, Oklahoma. It is expected to tap in at on the middle of the Rose Hill to Sooner line, and looks like it should provide some power flowing down towards Oklahoma City, kind of in between the Wichita, Oklahoma City area. As we move into the summer, we anticipate that this power flow will mostly go north to south down into Oklahoma City. And so with that, kind of touched on some of the constraints there, but we'll now kind of take a look more in depth into the congestion risks for this coming summer, and starting off by taking a look at the congestion we saw last summer and our expectations for those constraints going forward.
So looking at 2014 summer congestions, we have organized here the top 10 constraints ordered by total shadow price and our outlook for 2015. And the first two, we have Osage to Canyon East and Woodward congestion, and those were the top two constraints last year, and we ranked them as a high risk going into this summer. No surprise there that they're not going anywhere. As we move down the list, we see Renfro Transformer, Sun City to Medicine Lodge, South Hayes to Hayes. These last year were wind-driven, but since last year we have the introduction of the Y-plan, and this additional transmission has largely alleviated this risk. So we're ranking these as low risk going into 2015. A note on South Hayes to Hayes. Last year, this was largely a wind-driven constraint, and as I just mentioned, with the Y-plan, it's not anymore. However, what we have observed is that this constraint is sensitive to outages in the area. We saw congestion here during the winter. So that's something to note about South Hayes to Hayes. But still, it's ranked as a low risk as there are no outages on the schedule in the area at this time for this summer of 2015. Further down, we have Ogallala to Brule and Southwest Lawrence to Wakarusa. And last year, these were largely driven by two specific local outages. And this year, there aren't any outages on the schedule in the area, and we're ranking them as a low risk. Gentlemen to Red Willow and Red Willow to Mingo are ranked as a high risk. The drivers are Gentlemen running strong, weak wind in western Oklahoma and western Kansas, and also strong demand are all drivers for these constraints. Finally, Longwood to Oak Pan Har, we are ranking as a moderate risk. This is located in CSWS and is largely demand driven. And last year we saw some outages in the area that made this constraint worse. There are no outages on the schedule this year, however, it still remains a demand driven constraint.
All right, so kind of before we jump into real specific outage risks, we just wanted to kind of touch on the overall congestion outlook. As we typically note for summer, transmission outages are minimal. They're not usually doing a lot of work, particularly after June. We couldn't really find a number or any real significant outages in the July-August timeframe at this point. And with minimal planned generation outages, we're anticipating a pretty healthy supply stack, barring unit trips and things like that. So our most impactful constraints, we're expecting to be demand-driven constraints. When I say that, that means we're looking in southern SPP for the biggest risk in the Oklahoma City area and along the kind of Oklahoma-Arkansas borders where, we are seeing some pretty high load expectations in MISO. We expect that a lot of the risk is going to be moving power between SPP and MISO going on that west to east path or flowing power into the Oklahoma City area. And kind of touched on this already, this will be the first summer that we see market-to-market congestion. So this means that we're going to start binding MISO constraints in SPP. This is expected to be more of a real-time concern. As we noted in all of SPP's presentations on market-to-market congestion, this isn't supposed to be something that impacts the day-ahead market. However, we've already noted that we've seen Buckner-Spearville congestion, which is a western Kansas constraint, binding in MISO's day-ahead market. So while we anticipate most of the impact to be in the real time, this could be something that also gradually makes its way into the day-ahead. And our expectation is that most of these market-to-market constraints that are going to really impact SPP are going to happen in the southern part of the footprint again, where we're seeing, the load in Louisiana and the real warm days in Louisiana and kind of the Texas area that are going to be the major market-to-market constraints that impact SPP the most. The other typical constraint that we had been seeing on the market-to-market side of things was the Ireton Stranger Creek and those constraints around Kansas City. But with some newly installed transmission at Ireton to Nashua, we're anticipating that this area is much less of a concern this summer, leaving kind of most of the risk again to the southern part of the footprint.
So moving on to this slide, we have, as Steve mentioned, there aren't that many outages on the schedule for the summer. However, we have identified 5 risks here that we particularly like. First, the risk of Fairport to Osborne congestion is there because we see on the schedule Fairport to St. Joe, 345 kV is going to be out next week. And this is a 345 kV line running in the north of Kansas City. And when this line comes out, there's a parallel line at Fairport to Osborne, which is the lower voltage system. And we've seen in the past this relationship that Fairport to Osborne congest during these conditions. Moving on, we are marking risk for Vaughan transformer and Sioux City transformer congestion as there are interesting outages on the schedule. We have Fort Randall to Sioux City and Sioux City to Rasmussen on the schedule for outage, as well as Hoskins to Twin Church and Liberty to Stanislaus. These are large lines in the area, and from running different scenarios in Power World, we're seeing risk on these transformers. Next, this is interesting. Redbud to Arcadia and Arcadia to Jones we find as interesting risks. We've seen Arcadia to Jones congestion last week, and this is located in Oklahoma City. And when there's strong demand in Oklahoma City and when the Redbud unit is running, we see this congestion hit. So this is interesting, as we've just seen this last week. Definitely something to keep an eye on. Next, New Madrid to Sikeston. This is kind of interesting. This is on the border of Arkansas and Missouri. This is really the eastern border of SPP. And the reason why this is on the list is that we saw Idalia to Sikeston congest when New Madrid to Sikeston came out of service. So these are two lines that are kind of, one runs to the south, one runs to the west from Sikeston. And so when one of those lines came out, we saw strong congestion on the other. So this is something to watch out for. It's something that's probably infrequent, but if it does hit, it can hit hard, as we did see Idalia to Sikeston congest back in the winter, I believe. And the last risk that we're identifying here is Wolf Creek to Benton. And if you look at the transmission map, there are three 345 kV lines that run from Kansas City to Wichita, and Emporia Energy Center to Wichita has a scheduled outage, which is the northernmost line. And so what we've been seeing even now with this line in service is that when Lacine is running strong, and running both of its units, Lacine largely supplies Kansas City from the south. And what happens is that generation from Wolf Creek moves towards Wichita and loads up the lines there. So with this Emporia Energy Center to Wichita line outage in the north, we're just going to see further line flows on the lines from Wolf Creek to Wichita. And so we're calling for risk on Wolf Creek to Benton because last summer we saw this line congest. So there's a history there.
So we had a question back when we were talking about market-to-market congestion.
Yeah, well, this it might not be exactly related to market, but this was about a specific constraint, Cooper South. This is certainly a familiar constraint, and I think it's one that has not necessarily been eliminated by any new transmission projects, such as Ison to Stranger Creek. Basically, it didn't make the cut on the previous slide because it wasn't in the top 10 from last summer. So it fell out of that ranking, but there are specific constraints, some of which we'll even touch on here, such as Northwest Transformer, that I think will still be risks. So specifically for the Cooper South constraint, I think this is something that fundamentally all the pieces are still there, that we could see this from time to time. So
yeah, I think we'd kind of be looking for that congestion more so when we have high wind in MISO, it's particularly MISO North. In the kind of northwest Minnesota area and western Iowa. And, typically, as we mentioned, summer wind is not going to be as strong. And then the other big factor there is just generation around Kansas City. Right now, we have Nearman Creek and Sibley offline. We, as we mentioned, expect both those units to be back up and running for the most part during the summer. And overall better utilization out of the coal in Kansas City versus what we saw kind of in the shoulder season. So, units like Jeffrey Energy Center, which have been running a little bit weaker with the weak demand this spring, expect to see that unit running much stronger. When we have better, healthier generation in Kansas City, that means that Cooper South is less of a risk, particularly for the on-peak periods. Off-peak, that might be a concern or something to watch for, but I would not be as concerned with that in the on-peak. And as far as the market-to-market goes, just off the top of my head, I would say that that's a bigger risk in MISO's day ahead than it is in SPP's. We tend to see that get modeled pretty heavy in MISO's day ahead for minimal fundamental reasons, but doesn't bind as heavy in SPP's day ahead. And I think that that's probably what you would end up seeing as we head into the summer as well. So moving on to kind of some of the other non-outage related risks. The first one is on the market-to-market side of things. One that we were looking at is this Ringgold congestion. This was the 29th strongest constraint in MISO during last summer. And since the integration of market-to-market congestion in SPP, this has been the 7th strongest market-to-market congestion, which is interesting because this is much bigger risk in the summer, typically in MISO, than it is in the winter. So the fact that we've already seen this pretty strong in the market with the market-to-market congestion, we think that this will be a risk as demand starts to pick up in the Louisiana, Texas area in MISO. Over the winter, we mentioned there was line work at Lydia Valiant, which is one of the big drivers of why we were already seeing this congestion. So now, with the absence of line work, we're expecting this to be more of a demand-driven constraint. Another thing that we wanted to touch on, and we saw, I think, one print of this or 1 hour of this over the weekend, is the risk for the Bull Shoals to Midway congestion. This constraint is really driven by strong output from the Bull Shoals hydro unit and typically flows at its heaviest around the peak load hours. Basically, what we're looking at here is just the massive amount of rain that we've seen across the southern part of SPP and MISO. I think some places were 400% above, 800% above kind of their typical limits for this time of year. So we're expecting to see additional push from some of that hydro generation in the near term and be looking for some of the risk around Bull Shoals congestion, particularly in the real-time market. This is one that we also monitor the scheduled flow out of Bull Shoals, which is actually published on a publicly available website. Whenever that flows above 200 or closer to 225 megawatts, that's when this congestion seems to be a major risk. So we're looking for this constraint, more so around the peak hours. And anytime you see Bull Shoals scheduled to spill over 200 megawatts on their spill schedule. The other one that we're looking at, or kind of a little shift in dynamic, is the expectation that we see a little bit more Woodward congestion. As many of you know, we've been kind of seeing two different versions of Woodward, one with the contingency of northwest to Tutonga, and the other one with the contingency of the Woodward transformer. The Woodward transformer contingency version, we've actually chalked up a little bit more to seeing on not necessarily strong wind days, but stronger load days as power tries to move from the Oklahoma Panhandle into Oklahoma City. So as we see an increase in load in Oklahoma City, we're expecting to see a little bit more of the Woodward risk moving power into OKC, and a little bit less of the Woodward or the Osage type congestion, as we mentioned on that previous slide, with the potential for some new gas-fired generation on the bullish side of Woodward. That may be there to alleviate it, and just the west to east push is something that we're seeing a little bit more for the summer. We also mentioned there's some line outages around Arcadia, which may be bearish for the Redbud gas unit. And if Redbud is not running or not running as strong as it typically would, that is another thing that helps drive that west to east push into Kansas or Oklahoma City. So those are some things that we're looking at to kind of increase the Woodward risk for the summer. And the final thing was, as Jared mentioned, the addition of the Y plan has alleviated a number of wind-driven constraints, but we're questioning if this may help drive a little bit more demand-driven congestion, again, moving power towards Oklahoma City. With the strong summer demand, we could see some additional loading on some of those lines going towards the northwest transformer, and that's a constraint that we're thinking could bind and does typically bind a little bit more during the summer, and particularly over the peak load hours. So those are kind of some of the top constraint risks that aren't necessarily related to transmission outages. And I think at this point that kind of wraps it up for us. If there are any specific questions that we haven't gone over, we'd be happy to answer them now if you want to type them along. We also have our contact information down there at the bottom of the screen, so feel free to shoot us an IM or give us a call with any specific questions you might have. And we'll take a quick moment here and pause, and we'll come back with some questions in a second. All right, so we had a question here about the integrated system or WAPA integration into SPP, which is scheduled for October. We will definitely be following up, by the end of the summer with some more detailed information on this as we work to integrate this into our model. We are working hard right now to kind of take a look at this and get all that generation into our model. But overall, I mean, the general expectation, at least the gut feeling here, is that all that's going to do is add additional surplus generation to the northern part of the footprint, additional hydro, additional flows in from Canada, and really just, for me, to see it aggravate the north to south flow that we already have going on. I don't really see a lot of opportunity for this to not increase the north to south congestion pattern that we've been seeing for a while. And based on the generation and fuel mix that we see for a basin at this point, we have to think that, with a pretty solid surplus of, supply to demand, that it's only going to aggravate those north to south flows and increase some of that north-south basis that we've been seeing, particularly in the shoulder months. We will likely be doing another webinar, specifically focused on that with some more detail, but that's kind of my view of it off the cuff here.
All right, Steve, your next question. You just talk a little bit about north to south hub congestion for the summer.
Yep. So, again, much before the basin integration here, I think our expectation continues to be, some pretty, not necessarily north to south congestion, but congestion that's going to end up being more bullish on south hub. So these aren't going to be the constraints like Gentleman, Red Willow necessarily that are very bearish on North Hub and bullish on South, but more congestion that is, strictly speaking, bullish on the South MCCs and not necessarily impacting North Hub, but driving more upside to South Hub. So these are constraints specifically like the Northwest Transformer, some of these Ringgold to sales congestion, that are going to end up being more bullish to south. Additionally, Woodward, and particularly the Woodward transformer constraint versus the Woodward Northwest to Tonga constraint. The Woodward transformer version is more bullish on South Hub than the other version. So if you look at kind of the shift factors related to those two constraints, the transformer version has a bigger impact or a larger magnitude of an impact on self-hub. So that's another one that, again, it's more driving more upside to self-hub versus necessarily separating the two or driving significant downside to north hub.
I think that one could be a real problem, because we look at, as Josh told us, wind drops in July and August, and we're seeing some this low wind version of Woodward, as we're calling it, coupled with demand. It's a recipe for a real strong south hub for the summer. So. All right, so we touched on additional wind this summer, and just kind of in terms of impact, for better or worse, we see a stronger diurnal shape to the wind production for July and August. So certainly this will be bearish prices on pricing overall for the off-peak, and specifically the wind projects that connect on or near that Y plan in the western edge of the footprint. These will load up the contingencies for some very familiar constraints. So certainly have a bearish impact. It's hard to assess when these will be commercially live. So in terms of typically we don't know when they're commercial till it's right on top of us. So we'll try to get out ahead of it and see when we can really start to expect that to happen. And we will also incorporate all of these additions into our wind forecasting model. All these farms will be added as they are available and live. So we will, probably not this summer, but who knows, this fall maybe we'll be talking about 8+ gigs of wind records. It might be a little more attainable with another nearly 2 gigs in the mix.
Hey, we're still here. We're putting together some thoughts on some of these questions. I guess there's a question here about, has there been any change in or reduction in the coal stack as compared to last summer? And my answer to that is no. At this point, we haven't seen any real significant unit retirements, nothing that compares to what we saw in PJM or even in MISO. If they're, basically the way that I always like to look at this is, the units that are retiring, are they, what's the capacity factor, what's the utilization rate of those units? And even in MISO, the units that have retired are, units that weren't running to begin with. And I really haven't seen anything that stands out as significant as far as weaker coal or less available coal-fired generation. And then as far as lower gas prices this summer versus last, a couple things that, just looking at the difference here and kind of where we compare. One thing that I always take a look at is, how gas prices, compare to Powder River Basin coal. And, even with the, where we were at last year versus this year, we're still not competing with Powder River Basin, where, still above the threshold for, we need to be below 250 by a significant amount to really see a lot of competition with Powder River coal. With some of the higher price coal, where we're in there, and, we're a little bit closer than where we were last year. But that's just going to, I still think gas is the marginal unit. We're a little bit closer than we were last year, but I still, don't see a real significant push as far as coal to gas switching. And did you have anything that you wanted to add?
No, that's pretty much it. I mean, it's the shoulder months, certainly more interesting. There could be times in June where we still see some big wind days where coal may set the price. But I think particularly July and August will be, we still expect gas to be the marginal fuel. Just jump right into the next question here, or not? Well, let's do it.
Yeah.
Does congestion weigh heavily on the above normal temps that is in our weather forecast? If the temps come in at normal, how does that change the congestion outlook? I think this is a magnitude question. The difference between 92 and 94 degrees in Oklahoma City, you're still going to see Northwest Transformer. Maybe it's in terms of how long you see it. I think that's kind of the difference there. And again, when you talk about these average temps, there will be days that bring up that average temp, and there will be days that are below. So we'll have to kind of get into it a little bit to see some of those direct impacts on congestion. Long story short, Josh had mentioned downside risks, even if we see it come in normal. I don't really think that alters the landscape that much. Just maybe we see a couple fewer days where we're looking at pure demand-driven congestion.
All right. I think that's it for questions at this point. So again, please take the time to fill out the survey. I think you should see somewhere on your screens there with any feedback for us, so we can implement that into our next Outlook. If you have any questions after the presentation, feel free to contact us with the contact info there, and we will be sending out the slides to everyone who signed up for the presentation, so you will get a copy of the PowerPoint slides as well. So thanks for joining us today, and hope everyone has a great afternoon.